Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. This is a long overdue video for Element 3D. Over the last few months, I've received tons of requests for Element 3D tutorials, and while this is not the video I was intending to make, I happened upon this idea, and instead of scrapping it like I do with the majority of the stuff I mess around with, I thought that someone might find this interesting, so I went ahead and made this into a short tutorial. So today, we're going to be making some abstract 3D swirls in Element 3D. So if that sounds interesting, let's get started. Okay, so for the composition, I'm using UHD 4K, 30 FPS, and 150 frames. And for the project settings, I'm using 32 bits per channel, and I'm not linearizing. So to make the twirl, grab the pen tool and then drag out a straight line by holding the shift key. And for this, you want to make sure the fill mode is set to none. And for the width, I'm just using 20 pixels. Next, we can open up the shape layer and then add a twist. Open up the twist. And on the angle, you can crank this up quite a lot. You could do something like 10,000, which seems like a lot, but then we're going to end up recentering it so the twirl doesn't start going the opposite direction. It kind of ends there in the middle. For this next part, we actually need to see the rest of the twirl. If I zoom out here, you can see that most of this is cut off. So if we do Control K, I'm going to actually increase the resolution to 8K. So an 8K square, just so we can fit in the twirl. Now for this, it is important that you use a higher resolution rather than a lower resolution, because after this, we're going to be using the auto trace, and the auto trace does a much better job if the pixels that it's trying to trace are clean and they're not aliased or pixelated. So if you're using a full HD 1080 workspace, then I would double that to 4K just to do the trace. In this case, I am using a 4K image, so I want to double that just so we can work with something. Let's drag this out to the center. And next we can add a couple more twists. So open up both of the twists. And then for the first one, we could set the angle to something like 250. And then for the center, this is where you'll really notice the change. We do something like -500 and then -400. You can get some really interesting results by cranking those even more, but for this, I want to keep the swirl more intact. But you can play around with those and get some very, very interesting shapes. I'm going to do the same thing for the third twist there. Now, in order to animate these, we're going to hold down the Alt key and click the stopwatch for angle. And whatever number that you put in for the angle, you're going to type that in. So in this case, it's 10,000. Then you're going to say plus time multiplied by some value. So in this case, I'll do 100. So as we progress through the animation, more of that twist is going to kind of emit from the center. So it's going to push out the rest of the twists. I'm going to do the same thing for twist 2. So I'll click the stopwatch for angle, 250 plus time times 2. You can play around with these values and use other numbers here. This is just what I used. Now, just a quick note about the animations. It's better to have something that's slower than you think you might need than faster, because you can speed it up quite easily just by increasing the time of the layer, but you can't slow it down. And the reason is, when we use the auto trace keys the mask for every frame, and you can't slow that down without running into issues with either a stepping issue where the mask kind of jumps position and causes like a weird issue with motion blur, and then trying to add keyframes in between those is going to kind of mess up the masks. So it's better to keep it a little bit slower than you think, so you don't have to go back and then redo the trace. So if we go to the end here, you can see this kind of animating around, it's kind of rotating around. Next, we're going to add a turbulent displace effect, and this is going to add a lot more detail. And for this, I'll just use the default values, that's fine, but I will animate the evolution. So I'm going to click E to go to the turbulent displace effect, open that up, hold down the Alt key and click the stopwatch on evolution. And for this, I'm just going to zoom in here so we can see this a little bit more clearly. I'm just going to type in time times 100. And if we go forward just a little bit, you can see how it's kind of undulating a little bit. All right, so at this point, we can go back to composition settings and we can trim what we don't need off the comp. And honestly, we can trim quite a lot of this. The smaller your composition, the faster the auto trace will run. And I'm just gonna pull this up a little bit, just make sure that it is in frame. Another note about auto trace is that if your shape goes out of bounds or out of the composition workspace, then it won't trace it, and then it will kind of mess up your masks. All right, so now we can click on the shape layer, go up to layer, auto trace. So for the time span, make sure that it's set to work area, otherwise you'll only get one frame. And the channel, we're going to be using luminance. Now for the blur, I don't want any blur, so I'm going to make sure that that is set to 0. Definitely make sure it is 0, because sometimes the blur checkmark can sometimes enable itself. This is not the easiest tool to work with, but it's the only way that that I know of how to get masks into Element 3D, because unfortunately we can't use the shapes natively. We're also going to keep the tolerance really, really low, so I wouldn't go much higher than 2 pixels. In fact, you might even want to step that down so it's about 1.5 or something like that. So there's 2 problems. If the tolerance is too high, what can happen is your lines will kind of wave back and forth and they'll kind of look like they're jittering when you play them back. And if they're too low, then you can get really, really sharp vertices that are really noticeable in the 3D model. So I found that 2 pixel tolerance is pretty good, and for the minimum area, 0.5 pixel is pretty good. Threshold is just where it detects if it is to be traced or not, so this has a really high contrast of black and white, so 50% is fine, and for the corner roundness, I just left that at 0. Alright, so the auto trace can take anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute to like 15 minutes. It really just depends on how large of a resolution you're using. In this case, I'm using a very high resolution, and it also depends on the length of frames. Now, one other thing that can happen is auto trace is also a little bit unreliable, and sometimes it will just stop and you won't get all your keyframes. So if that happens, what I would do is just play around with the turbulent displacement settings, just change something and try again, and sometimes it does a better job at finishing that. I was working on some much longer animations with this and I had to do that. You may not run into it, but just as a little quick tip that might help. All right, so now we can change our composition back to UHD 4K or whatever the resolution is that you were using before. We don't require that square composition anymore. And then we can go ahead and add a new solid. So this solid is going to be for our Element 3D effect. Call that element and grab an element effect. So I can turn off the auto trace and the shape layer, and then in element, go into the custom layers, go into custom text and masks, and then select the auto trace layer. And then instead of source, we want to use masks. All right, so open up the scene setup and we can expand this here. And then we're going to go up to the top and just click extrude. And this will give the first frame, or whatever frame that we happen to be on, that will be the shape. So I can go into the orientation and drop that down to 90 degrees so it's on the floor. And then if we open up the extrusion model and select the first bevel, on the extrude we can increase that to 50, and this will give us a very, very tall structure. No matter what angle your camera is, you're really not going to see through it. Of course, you can change the extrude so it could be whatever you want, but this is what worked for me. Then I'm going to click OK. And next we need to add in a camera. So if you right click, go to new camera. All right, click OK. And if you are new to this version of After Effects, the unified camera tool has been replaced with the orbit tool. The controls are similar, but instead of the middle mouse being how you pan the camera, you have to hold down the Alt key to do that now. You can also just select the icons at the top next to the orbit key, but I think that the Alt key is better. All right, so if we open up group 1 and go into the particle look, and then open up deform, and then open up twist, this is where things get a lot more interesting. So you can play around with all sorts of different twisting for the X, Y's, and Z. There's also a phase, which kind of just shifts its position, essentially. So you can play around with these until you get something that you're happy with. And there's also the origin. That's kind of how you orient the twist or where it's centered. You can also use the bend modifiers as well. So spend some time trying to play around with these settings and find a good place to position your camera. So something like this looks pretty cool. And one thing that's really cool for this is to use some depth of field. So if you double click your camera, enable depth of field, drag this off to the side here. If we change the focus distance, and kind of center the focus on the center of the spiral there, and then you can increase the f-stop to something more reasonable, like a 1.4. It doesn't particularly matter though, we just want something that's blurry. And of course you can also override the blur level and just increase that to add more blur. All right, so right now we have a flat shaded object, and what I'd like to do is add a texture that we can control from the After Effects comp, not in Element 3D. So to do that, I'm going to create a new solid. Let's call this texture. And one effect that you can use, and it's pretty useful, is the 4 corner gradient. And I'm just going to leave that on the default settings for right now. Turn that layer off. And then in Element, we're going to go back to Custom Layers, and this time we're going to go to the Custom Texture Maps, select Texture, use Effects and Masks, and then we'll go back into the Scene Setup. So on the extrusion model here, we're going to change the texture mapping to Plane XY, and then in Bevel 1, in the Diffuse, we'll select where it says Non-Set, and then add in the custom texture map. We can copy that and then paste that on Reflectivity as well. So for the Reflectivity, we'll set that to 100%, and that is all we need to do here. All right, so this is temporary right now, but there's too much black space, I think, in that corner there. So I'm just gonna change the camera orientation, find a better position for the camera. All right, so something like this, I think, is gonna be a little bit better for what I want. The other shot was interesting, but too much negative space in the back there. All right, so before we move on, we're gonna go back into the scene setup here and then add an environment. So the default box isn't really giving us the right reflections. It's just too bright. So I'll just choose one of these basic ones here that comes with Element 3D. And then I'm gonna drop down the glossiness to 50%. This looks closer to what I want. If we go back to the texture layer, we can play around with the colors on the 4-color gradient, just kind of choose something that works a little bit better. Now, of course, you can do this with a regular texture too. It does not have to be a 4-color gradient, but this effect does allow you to interact with the texture by clicking and dragging these corner pins. And you can move these around and just play around with the color. I actually am going to turn this off and just keep it black and white because I think that looks a little bit more interesting for what I wanted for this background. Let's go back into the scene setup really fast. Go into the environment, and I'm going to increase the brightness of the environment. Pull that up to about 35% or so, then click OK. This kind of boosts the reflections a little bit. And we can also add some extra lighting. So if we go to Render Settings, open up lighting, you can add an additional light. So we could try something like basic, and then open up additional lighting, and then increase the intensity. So I can just crank that all the way up to the maximum. There's also a rotation parameter, so you can just shift where that light is. And instead of having to go in and mess around with After Effects lights, which are fine to do, After Effects is not the greatest 3D app. And it's just, I find everything really clunky about navigating in After Effects, to be honest. So if I don't have to mess around with lights, that's fine. So the feature here is a nice feature, just to be able to add some stylized lighting here. So that looks kind of interesting. Now there's loads of different post effects that you could do with this, but I'm just going to grab a curves effect, just crank that up a little bit. Now there is something I forgot to do, and I forgot to change the reflections on the object itself. So to fix that, we're going to have to go back into Element 3D, select the extrusion model, scroll down to reflect mode, and on the mode, change that to mirror surface. And then you need to check render self. Then click OK, and the result is going to be a lot darker, but the reflections on the side are going to be a lot more realistic. Now, of course, you could go completely weird with this and even blur out everything in between these extruded parts of the twirl. So this is pretty interesting. There's lots of different things you could do with this. Of course, you don't have to use swirls. You can use a lot of different types of shapes. The only limitation really is there's no real way in Element 3D to adjust the model. So you do need to make sure that whatever is generated from the auto trace is good. So you could spend a long time trying to make sure that whatever masks that are generated are good enough for you to use to extrude. Of course, using something like Maya or Cinema 4D or whatever you want is going to give you a lot more control. But this is a really super quick and easy way to get some kind of abstract looking shape. And this looks quite good even just as a still too. But we can go ahead and render this out and then see what the whole thing looks like. And I have here just some other quick versions that I did just by playing around with different twists and different materials. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. I have a couple more Element 3D tutorials coming. They just take so long to produce and get to a quality that I'm happy with. So things like this, it was such a quick one that I almost just scrapped the whole thing, and I wasn't really even intending to make a tutorial out of it. I just happened to stumble upon it and thought it was kind of interesting. So hope you guys enjoyed that. If you did, a like really helps out the channel. If you have any questions, I have a Discord server now. So if you jump on there, you can add screenshots or post videos and stuff. So if you are interested in that, head on over there and check that out. Otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.